We just want to know what happened and why our baby didn't come home.
The mother of one of the boys who was with Nolan apparently posted on social media that Nolan made a decision to stay on the island and then return inland later with another group of friends. Were you made aware of that plan beforehand? Is that something that Nolan would have done or would do often?
No.
No, he wouldn't. Nolan was always taught to stay with the group. If you leave with me, you come back with me. So that I don't understand. And with me being a parent, if I was in that situation, I would have told him, you're gonna get back on this boat with me because I don't wanna have to answer to your parents if something happened to you.
Right.
So you're gonna get on the boat, and if you still don't wanna get on the boat, someone give me a phone so I can make a phone call to get your parents on the phone so they can tell you to get on the boat. But at no time will I leave someone else's child especially on the island.
So you think
stranded.
he got left behind then?
Yes. I don't believe he decided to stay on the island by himself. It just doesn't, that's not his character.
The hardest words a parent can ever say are often the ones they've been holding back the longest. For months, the public has debated what happened to 18-year-old Nolan Wells. Countless theories have spread across social media. Investigators have released statements. Attorneys have spoken publicly. Witnesses have shared their versions of events. But through all the noise, one voice remained largely unheard. Until now. Nolan Wells' father has finally broken his silence. And what he revealed doesn't point to a new piece of physical evidence. It doesn't rely on rumors or internet speculation. Instead, it begins with something much simpler and, perhaps, much more difficult to ignore. His son. The young man he raised. The lessons he spent nearly 2 decades teaching. Because according to Nolan's father, there's one detail about the official explanation that has never made sense, not from the very first moment he heard it. If you followed this case, you've probably heard one version of events, that Nolan willingly stayed behind on Horn Island after his friends left, that he chose not to return with the group, that he intended to make his own way back later. But his father says that's the very reason he knew something was wrong, not because he already knew what had happened, but because he knew who Nolan was. So ask yourself this: why would an 18-year-old college football player, with his entire future ahead of him, voluntarily remain alone on a remote barrier island after the rest of his group departed? Why would someone who had spent years preparing for football, school, and the next chapter of his life suddenly abandon the people he arrived with? And perhaps the biggest question of all, if Nolan truly planned to stay behind, then why did so many questions later emerge about the location of his phone, the timeline of that afternoon, and the sequence of events that followed? His parents say none of those pieces fit together in a way that reflects the son they knew. Not the disciplined athlete, not the responsible teenager, not the young man who had been taught one rule over and over again since he was a child. A rule so deeply ingrained that his father says it shaped every outing, every trip, every decision involving friends. That single lesson has now become one of the family's biggest reasons for questioning whether the initial explanation tells the full story. Tonight, we'll examine what Nolan's father actually said, compare it with the publicly reported timeline, and explore why his words have reignited discussion about one of the most talked about unanswered questions surrounding this case. We'll separate confirmed facts from claims, revisit the final known hours before Nolan disappeared, and look at the unanswered questions that continue to trouble those closest to him. Because sometimes the most important clue isn't something investigators discover. It's something a parent has known all along. Before we continue, if you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on verified information and thoughtful analysis, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue producing in-depth investigations like this one, and it ensures you won't miss future updates as new verified developments emerge. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the 4th of July weekend, the trip that would forever change the Wells family's lives. For Nolan Wells, the 4th of July weekend was supposed to be a brief escape before returning to the routine that had already shaped much of his young life. He wasn't simply another teenager looking for a holiday adventure. At just 18 years old, Nolan had developed a reputation as someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Friends and family described him as disciplined, respectful, and deeply committed to football. The sport wasn't just something he enjoyed. It was a path toward the future he had been working to build for years. Like countless young adults celebrating Independence Day, Nolan joined a group of friends for a trip to Horn Island, a remote barrier island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Known for its untouched beaches and isolation from the mainland, the island attracts boaters looking for a peaceful getaway, especially during holiday weekends. By all publicly available accounts, the trip began like many others. Friends gathered together. Boats headed toward the island. The atmosphere was festive. Nothing about that morning suggested the weekend would become the focus of a nationwide discussion. For Nolan, there were reasons to come home. Football commitments were waiting. He had plans for the weeks ahead. There were opportunities he had been preparing for, and according to those closest to him, he was excited about what lay ahead. Family members have consistently described him as someone who looked toward the future, not someone who simply drifted from one day to the next. That matters, because every investigation eventually reaches a point where people ask not only what happened, but why someone would make a particular decision. The Wells family says that's exactly where their doubts began. Not after weeks of investigation, not after public speculation. Almost immediately. Because as the story of that weekend unfolded, they were told something they found almost impossible to believe. But before reaching that moment, it's important to understand why Nolan's father's words carry so much weight. Throughout this case, many opinions have circulated online. Attorneys have offered legal perspectives. Commentators have examined timelines. Independent investigators have reviewed publicly available information. Social media users have developed countless theories, often reaching very different conclusions. Yet none of those people knew Nolan the way his father did. Parents spend years watching patterns develop. They learn what excites their children. They recognize habits that others overlook. They understand which decisions would be typical and which would seem completely out of character. For Nolan's father, this wasn't about trying to solve the investigation himself. It was about reconciling what he was hearing with the son he had spent 18 years raising. According to public interviews, there was one lesson he had repeated throughout Nolan's childhood. It wasn't complicated. If you go somewhere together, you leave together. To many families, that may sound like ordinary advice. For the Wells family, Nolan's father says it was something he emphasized repeatedly over the years. Whether they were traveling with friends, attending events, or spending time away from home, the expectation remained the same. Don't separate from your group. Don't assume someone else will figure things out. If everyone arrives together, everyone leaves together. His father says Nolan understood that lesson. Not once, not occasionally, but throughout his life. That is why, when the family was later told Nolan had voluntarily remained behind while everyone else departed, they say the explanation immediately conflicted with everything they believed about his character. It's important to note that this doesn't establish what actually happened that day. Knowing someone's personality cannot, by itself, explain the events of an investigation. But it can explain why certain accounts immediately raise questions for those who knew them best. For Nolan's father, the concern wasn't built on internet rumors. It wasn't based on speculation from strangers. It was rooted in years of watching his son make decisions that reflected the values he had been taught. According to the family's public statements, Nolan wasn't someone who casually ignored responsibilities. He understood commitment. Football demanded it. School required it. Life rewarded it. His parents believed he approached each of those areas with the same level of discipline. That's why, when they were told he supposedly stayed behind after the group left the island, they say it didn't sound like Nolan. It sounded like someone else. Or at least, a version of Nolan they simply didn't recognize. As the family tried to understand what had happened, they found themselves replaying every conversation they had ever had with him. Every lesson, every expectation, every memory. The more they reflected, the more one question refused to go away. If Nolan knew he was supposed to leave with the people he came with, why would he suddenly choose not to? That question would become even more difficult after a phone call changed everything. Until that moment, the Wells family believed they were simply waiting for Nolan to return home from a holiday weekend like so many before it. Instead, they would receive news that transformed an ordinary family vacation into a desperate search for answers. The phone call came without warning. Like so many life-changing moments, it began as an ordinary day before suddenly becoming one the family would remember forever. According to public accounts shared by Nolan's family, there was no indication that anything had gone seriously wrong. The expectation was simple. Nolan would return home after spending the holiday with friends, and life would continue as planned. Instead, the family learned something that immediately shattered that expectation. Nolan hadn't come back. At first, those words didn't seem to make sense. Someone doesn't simply disappear after spending the weekend with friends. There had to be an explanation. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe he had taken another boat. Maybe his phone battery had died. Families often cling to ordinary possibilities before allowing themselves to consider something far worse. But as the minutes passed, reassurance never came. Instead, uncertainty grew. The people who had expected Nolan to return with them were now saying he wasn't there. Somewhere between the island and home, the routine had been broken. For Christine Wells, Nolan's mother, that realization reportedly triggered immediate panic. Every parent knows the uneasy feeling that comes when a child doesn't answer a call or return a message. But this was different. Time kept moving, yet Nolan remained unaccounted for. Soon, what had started as concern became a missing person case. The family's focus shifted instantly. Where had Nolan last been seen? Who had spoken with him? Who knew where he was? Every answer seemed to create another question. As relatives searched for information, they also found themselves trying to piece together a timeline that was becoming increasingly difficult to understand. Location-sharing applications reportedly became one of the first tools they relied on. Could his phone reveal where he had gone? Was it still on the island? Had it moved somewhere else? If the phone could be located, perhaps Nolan could be located too. But according to publicly discussed accounts, the information they received only added to the confusion. Different people appeared to have different understandings of where Nolan had last been. Questions arose about the location of his phone. Questions arose about when certain people left the island. Questions arose about who had last seen him. As authorities from multiple agencies became involved, the investigation also had to navigate questions of jurisdiction. Because Horn Island sits in an area involving different responding agencies, coordinating search efforts was not necessarily as straightforward as many people assumed. For Nolan's parents, however, those procedural realities offered little comfort. Every passing hour mattered. Every unanswered call felt longer than the last. Every delay seemed impossible to ignore. Anyone who has followed missing person investigations knows that time is often one of the most valuable resources investigators have. Families naturally hope that every minute is used as effectively as possible. As search efforts continued, the Wells family waited for updates that they hoped would bring clarity. Instead, they say they were given an explanation that immediately conflicted with everything they believed about Nolan. According to statements that have been publicly discussed, investigators relayed a version of events suggesting that Nolan had remained on the island after the rest of the group departed. It was reportedly suggested that he chose to stay behind and intended to return later. That explanation quickly became one of the central points of discussion surrounding the case. If true, it would mean Nolan made a conscious decision to separate from the group. If not, then an important part of the timeline still needed to be understood. For Nolan's parents, the issue wasn't simply whether that explanation was possible. It was whether it matched the son they knew. His father has repeatedly emphasized that Nolan was focused on his future. Football wasn't just a hobby. It represented opportunity. He had responsibilities waiting for him. He had commitments he intended to keep. Family members have described him as someone who valued structure and accountability, someone who understood that small decisions could affect much bigger goals. They say he wasn't careless with those goals. That is why, when they were told he supposedly remained behind voluntarily, they struggled to accept it. Again, this doesn't establish what happened that day. Character alone cannot answer every investigative question. But it helps explain why the family's doubts began almost immediately. They weren't rejecting the explanation because it was inconvenient. They were questioning it because, in their view, it conflicted with years of lived experience. As the investigation unfolded, another complication emerged. Different people appeared to remember key moments differently. Public reporting and interviews began revealing accounts that didn't always align perfectly with one another. Who saw Nolan last? When exactly did certain conversations occur? What happened before the boats left? Was there an argument? If so, what was it about? Some accounts suggested one sequence of events. Others appeared to describe something different. The more the public learned, the harder it became to fit every piece neatly into a single timeline. And as those inconsistencies attracted growing attention, one object began standing out more than almost anything else in the investigation. Nolan's phone. For his family, it wasn't simply another piece of personal property. It had the potential to answer questions that people couldn't. It could contain messages, calls, location information, photos, videos, conversations from the final hours before Nolan disappeared. In many modern investigations, a phone can become one of the most important sources of digital evidence. For the Wells family, it represented the possibility that the timeline could eventually be clarified, not through memory alone, but through records that might objectively show what happened during those critical final hours. Whether those records would ultimately answer the family's questions remained uncertain. But from that point forward, the phone would become one of the most closely discussed aspects of the entire case. For Nolan's family, the phone represented far more than a personal belonging. It represented a timeline, a witness that couldn't forget. Unlike people, phones don't rely on memory alone. They record locations, preserve conversations, document calls, and often capture the ordinary moments that later become critically important. That is why so much attention eventually centered on Nolan's device. Public discussion surrounding the case has included questions about what information the phone may have contained before investigators gained access to it. Family members and others speaking publicly have expressed concern that conversations, photos, videos, or location history from the hours leading up to Nolan's disappearance could have helped clarify what occurred. Among the digital platforms frequently mentioned was Snapchat. Because many conversations on Snapchat disappear automatically, timing can become especially important. If messages aren't preserved, they may no longer be available later. That reality led to public questions about whether any relevant communications from Nolan's final hours could still be recovered through investigative methods or legal requests. The Wells family has consistently emphasized that they believe every possible source of digital evidence should be thoroughly examined. Their position has not been that any single message would solve the case overnight. Rather, they believe every available piece of information matters. A single conversation, a location update, a timestamp, a photograph. Any one of those details could potentially help investigators better understand the sequence of events. As public interest continued to grow, another topic began drawing widespread attention: a video. According to various public statements and media reports, there were discussions about footage said to have captured an argument involving Nolan during the trip. Descriptions of that footage have varied, and not every detail has been independently confirmed. Some accounts suggested the recording included Nolan asking for his phone. Others described hearing voices engaged in a disagreement. Still others questioned exactly what the audio revealed, or whether certain voices had been conclusively identified. Because those descriptions differ, it's important to distinguish between what has been publicly claimed and what has been independently verified. To date, Public reporting has not definitively established every detail of the recording, and different interpretations continue to circulate. For investigators, determining the authenticity, context, and significance of any recording would naturally be an important part of the investigative process. For the family, however, the larger concern remained unchanged. If a disagreement occurred shortly before Nolan disappeared, they wanted to understand exactly what happened. What was the argument about? Who was involved? How did it end? Did it have any connection to the events that followed, or was it unrelated? Those questions remain part of the broader discussion surrounding the case. As more people began examining the publicly available information, attention also shifted toward the handling of potential evidence. Family members, legal commentators, and independent investigators publicly questioned whether every possible step had been taken as quickly as it could have been. Those concerns included discussions about when Nolan's phone came into investigators' possession, whether digital information had been fully preserved, and whether delays, if any occurred, could have affected the recovery of electronic evidence. It's important to note that these concerns reflect questions raised publicly and should not be interpreted as findings of wrongdoing. In any complex investigation, maintaining the integrity of evidence is essential. Digital devices can contain valuable information, but preserving that information often depends on careful procedures and timing. Because of those realities, questions about evidence preservation became part of the public conversation. Could additional data still be recovered? Were deleted messages permanently lost? Would forensic analysis reveal information no one had previously seen? Those are technical questions that specialists in digital forensics are often called upon to answer. Several legal analysts discussing the case publicly have also pointed to broader investigative questions. Why were certain investigative steps taken when they were? Were all available witnesses interviewed promptly? Could additional search warrants or forensic examinations provide more clarity? Did announcing preliminary conclusions too early risk influencing public perception before every question had been answered? These questions have been raised publicly by commentators and analysts reviewing the case. They are part of the ongoing discussion and should not be understood as conclusions about the investigation itself. At the same time, independent investigators and legal experts have noted that digital evidence can sometimes be recovered even after information appears to have been deleted. Modern forensic techniques are capable of retrieving certain data under specific circumstances, though what can ultimately be recovered depends on many factors. For Nolan's parents, those possibilities offered a measure of hope. Not hope for an easy answer, but hope that technology might eventually provide clarity where memories and conflicting accounts had not. Throughout every interview they have given, one message has remained remarkably consistent. They are not asking the public to accept a particular theory. They are not demanding that anyone reach conclusions before investigators do. Instead, they continue to return to one simple point. The explanation they initially received does not match the Nolan they knew. His father has spoken about the values he tried to instill from childhood: responsibility, loyalty, discipline, looking after the people you're with, leaving together, coming home together. Those weren't just words repeated during family conversations. He says they were principles Nolan lived by. Whether others agree with that assessment or not, understanding why the family continues asking questions begins with understanding how strongly they believe those values shaped Nolan's decisions. For them, this has never been about refusing to accept difficult truths. It has been about making sure every reasonable question receives a complete answer. As of today, the investigation remains an important point of public interest. Authorities have released official findings regarding Nolan's death, while the family has also pursued independent examinations in an effort to better understand what happened. Public discussions have included the results of autopsy findings, toxicology reports, and statements from law enforcement, alongside the family's continued belief that unanswered questions remain. Although officials have shared their conclusions based on the evidence available to them, Nolan's parents have continued to advocate for a thorough examination of every lead they believe could provide additional clarity. That commitment has never wavered. For them, this case is not defined by headlines. It is defined by their son. Before he became the subject of national attention, Nolan Wells was simply an 18-year-old young man with plans for his future. He was a football player working toward bigger opportunities, a student preparing for the next chapter of his education, a son whose parents expected him to come home, a friend whose absence would forever change the lives of those who knew him. Whatever conclusions people ultimately reach after reviewing the publicly available information, one fact remains beyond dispute. A family lost someone they loved. And for that family, the search for understanding did not end the day the headlines faded. It continues every single day. Nolan's father has made one belief unmistakably clear. He does not believe his son chose to stay behind. Whether future investigative developments answer every remaining question is something only time will reveal. Until then, the Wells family says they will continue seeking the truth, following every verified lead and asking the questions they believe still deserve answers. As with every true crime case, our goal is not to decide guilt or innocence, nor to promote speculation. It is to carefully examine the verified facts, distinguish them from claims, and follow developments as they emerge. If new, confirmed information becomes available in the Nolan Wells investigation, we'll continue covering it here with the same commitment to accuracy and fairness. And perhaps that's the most important reminder this case leaves us with. Behind every investigation is a family waiting for answers. Behind every headline is a life that mattered. And behind every unanswered question is the hope that one day, the full truth will finally come to light.